Thank you for downloading this Real Agriculture podcast. Next thing you know the next thing. Next is Now is a short podcast discussing agriculture's emerging next-gen tech and trends as they're happening in our industry. Next is Now, presented by GFL Ag. Listen where you get your podcasts today.
Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Let's talk trade around the beef industry in particular. And we're joined right now by the Executive Vice President with the Canadian Cattle Association, is Dennis Laycraft, based out of Calgary, Alberta. Hey, Dennis, how's it going?
Well, other than the rule that was announced today, things
I
going fine.
I didn't want to be the black cloud here. So you've alluded to it. We've got the final rule on the product of U.S.A. labeling. Secretary Vilsack was at the NFU meeting today, Monday, in Scottsdale, Arizona, made an announcement regarding the final rule. The way I read the press release from the USDA, it looks like it's the same rule today as it was heading into the Office of Management and Budget.
Yeah, in a nutshell, that's what came out today, that it's going to maintain the born, raised, slaughtered, and processed in the U.S. definition, and for anybody using product of U.S.A. And, that makes it one of the most onerous rules in the world for that designation.
So there's lots of examples to sort of provide context here, but essentially it has to meet all of those requirements in order for that steak, for example, to say product of the U.S.A., it has to meet all those requirements. So, for example, an animal that doesn't meet one of them can't carry that label. That's correct. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And the label is to be voluntary, but you've already seen USDA announce mandatory procurement requirements for some of their purchase programs that is now based on this definition. So when you start to have mandatory buying requirements, you start to then move to where is it becoming a condition of business, and then you start to get into the de facto mandatory area that we all would like to avoid.
Dennis, what's the difference? One of the things I hear a lot from our American audience is, well, you guys have a Canadian label. We're just doing the same thing. And I remember you telling me previously there is a difference. What is it?
One, certainly there's two things. Most of the time when you see our Canadian label on beef, it's a Canada beef label. It's a trademark label. It isn't a government regulation. So we work with companies, and it's got a whole bunch of quality characteristics associated with it. Now, we have a product of Canada definition, and, to be honest, we'd like to see ours changed as well. But we do allow about the only animals we bring up from the U.S., and we bring a large number. It can be up to 350,000 head of feeder animals.
Yep.
We have a residency period where those animals all qualify for product of Canada because they're fed in Canada. Most of their weight and their growth is here in Canada. So we found a way of facilitating virtually all of the imports from the U.S. to qualify for product of Canada, where this rule basically disqualifies any animals from Canada or Mexico or anywhere else. But interestingly enough, we bring those same feeder cattle up from the U.S., fed in Canada. If many of them go back to the U.S., they don't qualify for product of U.S. So it's certainly not going to help that trade either, which has been pretty important to a number of U.S. producers as well.
Do you have, or have you been able to quantify the potential costs that this final rule could have on the Canadian industry or the American industry for that matter?
It's hard at this stage. First of all, there's some people who may just choose to ignore. When I say ignore, just not use product to U.S.A. on their labeling because it's going to be, that onerous definition. It sort of starts to come back to, if it gets broadly adopted and it becomes a condition of trade, what we saw under mandatory country of origin labeling between cattle and hogs, it cost about $1 billion a year to the Canadian industry. So it was quite significant. quite often we were seeing discounts that were in the $45 an animal for all animals that were going to the States on feeder cattle. And likewise, there were discounts, but the impact was much greater than that. We had a number, we went from 17 plants that were processing cattle every day of the week to 7. And there were only 3 of those that were processing every day a week. So we had a number of them that were only processing certain days of the week. So all of our exports were compressed. And when you have a shortage of truckers, for instance, that exacerbates that problem. In some cases, people had to ship animals another 1,200 kilometers from what would have been their normal customers. So the transportation impacts, you just had a whole range of consequences when these things get put into place. And, we're going to be monitoring that very closely over the next I guess it's 20 months before it gets implemented. So.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. With the implementation date, that's 20 months out. So Canada does have, from when we had mandatory country of origin labeling, Canada does reserve the right through the WTO to retaliate. Does this qualify? Do you think Canada be retaliating, or is this a wait and see, or this is a different lane completely from that WTO ruling? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's certainly not a different lane at all. The fundamental basis of the ruling in the mCOOL case was that this measure resulted in some discrimination against live cattle and hog imports from Canada and Mexico, and that had to do with that segregation costs. So there were extra costs in handling our animals, and that including the labeling, but most of it was the segregation prior to it being processed. Or as I mentioned, there are a whole bunch of other costs because of plants that just simply because of the rules chose not to continue processing those animals. So, if we start to see that level of segregation again on imported animals, then that starts to move us to where we can say this rule is having the same impact that mCOOL had. And so we'll be gathering and watching that very closely. And, certainly that'll become more apparent as the rule gets closer to coming into effect.
Dennis, when this process started, it was about beef coming out of South America, say Uruguay, ending up in the US, repackaged into a different box, and then putting product to the USA on it. And I remember you and I chatting, and the fear was scope creep because, hey, that example, that's not right. It needs to be fixed. Makes sense. And the scope creep you were worried about appears to be what the reality is at this point. It's now we've encompassed a whole bunch of other things in this process. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. It certainly opened the door to bringing back this much broader definition that was basically part of mCOOL. Now they've added process, so they've made it an even more prescriptive definition moving forward. And that was the issue, was some people were bringing some product in, just basically taking it out, cutting it up, selling it as steaks and putting product to U.S.A. on it, which that could have been corrected by a number of other options that would have recognized the level of integration in North America and the benefits of that integration.
So next steps, you said 20 months till the implementation. I'm assuming there's really no process of like appeal. It's not that kind of a process. Is this something that the Canadian and Mexican industry will be working to try to fix as a carve out if USMCA is reopened, or is there an opportunity to pursue exemption or carve out for Canada and Mexico without having to go through that process? What are the next steps from a Canadian perspective?
Yeah, I think we need to engage with our U.S. counterparts. This won't be a Canada or Canada-Mexico solution. Something we'll be visiting, as you mentioned. It's a big issue for many feeders in Texas. It's a big issue for a number of feeders in Kansas and Nebraska in particular that bring a lot of Canadian feeder animals in. So we're going to be sitting down and trying to walk through where we move with this. And, there's a couple possibilities. First of all, there may be a lot of people just look at it and say, this is just too difficult to utilize. And, our concern is, as you keep seeing these procurement requirements based on this rule, at what point you hit a point where they just feel they have to do it. So we'll be monitoring that, but our preference would be to come up with something that is based more on the Codex rule. As you go through the rule, there's actually going to be two productive U.S.A. Definitions. There's one for export that they say each country determines with the U.S., and then there's the product of U.S.A. in the United States, because you do have to put your country product designation on all products that we export. And it makes a lot more sense for us to align with the international. And Codex is basically can determine that slaughter in most cases conveys origin. It's about as substantial a transformation, and these definitions are a lot bigger than just agri-food. There are so many things you purchase that are part of the inputs are raised here, they're moved somewhere else, then it's manufactured or processed into something more, and then there's lots of examples where there's accumulation and different things, but rather than creating this whole litany of definitions and descriptions out there, you come up with sort of these generally accepted rules like you see under Codex. And that's a conversation that we intend to continue to pursue, but we've got to, I think, get the right group of people together when we have that conversation, if we're going to be successful with it.
Dennis, thanks so much for joining us here today. I do appreciate it. This won't be the last time we talk about this story. I am sure of that at this point. And until next time, cheers.
Yeah, take care.